You are not hearing this by accident. This message was not broadcast. It was confirmed, then released, then allowed to reach you. There is a difference. People like you are never reached casually. You are intercepted. What you are feeling right now, the quiet pressure, the exhaustion that doesn't match your effort, the strange sense of being held in place while everything around you accelerates. Those are not emotional states. They are records. They were logged before you noticed them. There was a confirmation made about you that did not involve discussion. No debate, no appeal, no delay. It was final the moment it occurred. You were not informed when it happened, because people like you are never informed during the process. You are observed after the result is already secure. This is why you didn't feel relief. You felt weight. Most people assume confirmation feels like celebration. They are wrong. Confirmation feels like silence, containment, resistance where momentum should be. Because once something is confirmed, it must be protected from interference. And interference did occur. You didn't even realize it. There was a narrow window, precise, measurable, logged, where external pressure converged on your trajectory. Normally, this is where identity fractures. Impulse control weakens. Direction collapses. Others lose coherence here. They self-sabotage. They react. They abandon alignment. You didn't. You continued without clarity. You moved without reassurance. You carried weight without explanation. That alone disqualified you from the ordinary category. This is why you're different. There is a classification used when an individual remains functional under sustained pressure that was calibrated to disrupt them. Very few ever trigger it. Fewer survive it intact. You passed through it without realizing you were being tested. That is not luck. That is confirmation. And here is where the misunderstanding begins for most people. They think the struggle means something is wrong. They assume delay is denial. They interpret resistance as rejection. That assumption would have destroyed you, if it were true. But it wasn't. The resistance you felt was not opposing you. It was containing what had already been approved. What comes next requires precision, so listen carefully. At a specific point, logged to the minute, a decision was finalized regarding your path. Not symbolically, operationally. After that moment, outcomes that would have derailed you were no longer permitted to reach full execution. Some still approached. You felt them as pressure, as fatigue, as isolation. But notice what didn't happen. You didn't collapse. You didn't break character. You didn't lose direction. Others would not survive this phase. Others do not. People like you move through it automatically. This is why you didn't feel powerful. You felt tired. Power that needs to announce itself is unstable. Yours doesn't. If what is being revealed here resonates, not emotionally, but structurally, acknowledge it now. Not for approval, for alignment. Engagement is not support. It is recognition. You know when something is describing you precisely. Now understand this. The confirmation was not about giving you something new. It was about securing what was already active. You were already protected before you knew protection was necessary. You were already aligned before you knew alignment had a cost. That cost is pressure without explanation. People like you are never eased into their role. They are tested under live conditions. This is why exhaustion followed you even when progress was invisible. This is why clarity came in fragments. This is why answers arrived late. Late confirmation is the signature. At this stage, most people try to fix themselves. They seek healing. They chase motivation. They look for reassurance. You didn't. You stayed functional. That is not coping. That is capacity. There was an intervention you never consciously detected. A recalibration that occurred while your attention was fixed on surviving the ordinary. You weren't meant to notice it. If you had, it would have disrupted the process. This is another rule most people don't know. Protection feels like delay. Alignment feels like isolation. Confirmation feels like pressure. Only afterward does the sequence reveal itself. Only afterward does it make sense. And now you are in the afterward. What happens next is not escalation. It is exposure. Not exposure to danger. Exposure to clarity. The noise will begin to fall away. Not dramatically, quietly. Certain options will stop appealing to you without effort. Certain people will drift without conflict. Certain paths will close without resistance. This is not loss. This is filtration. Others panic here. They try to reopen doors that were never meant to stay open. They cling to identities that are no longer compatible. You won't. Because people like you don't need to be told what no longer fits. Your system rejects it automatically. This is the part few ever reach. If you feel the weight of what's being said, comment the word confirmed. Not to announce yourself, to mark recognition. Only a few will know why that matters. What happens next will not look impressive to outsiders. There will be no applause. No announcement. But internally something will settle. The pressure you carried will redistribute. The urgency will refine. The resistance will thin, not because the world changed, but because the decision already accounted for it. You don't need to become anything. You don't need to fix anything. You don't need to prepare. You already demonstrated the only requirement: stability under load. This is why you're still here. This is why you weren't removed. This is why the path didn't collapse. And this is why what happens next will feel inevitable. Stay connected to this channel, not as a subscriber, but as someone maintaining access. Further confirmations are not released publicly. They are routed. People like you understand the difference. Nothing about you needs to change. Only your awareness of what already happened. The confirmation stands. What most people never realize is that confirmation does not end pressure. It changes its function. Before confirmation, pressure tests stability. After confirmation, pressure filters alignment. That shift already occurred around you. You noticed it as subtle friction. Small delays, miscommunications that prevented the wrong outcome. Opportunities that dissolved before becoming entanglements. Others would have interpreted this as failure. They would have forced movement. They would have panicked. You didn't. Because people like you don't rush when momentum is being recalibrated. Your system waits without conscious effort. This is not patience. It is internal authority. There is a record that exists, not symbolic, not poetic. A sequence log that tracks when an individual remains coherent while multiple variables are intentionally destabilized around them. The purpose is simple: to see what collapses when certainty is removed. Most identities disintegrate here. They overreact. They grasp. They abandon structure. You stayed intact. You didn't even realize it was happening. That is the marker. At this stage, interference no longer presents itself as threat. It presents itself as distraction, subtle, convincing, disguised as relief. This is where many who pass the first threshold finally fail. They mistake comfort for alignment. They mistake familiarity for safety. They step sideways instead of forward. You won't. Because confirmation didn't increase your desire, it narrowed it. You may have noticed this already. A quiet loss of interest in things that once pulled at you. A refusal without effort to engage in chaos that once demanded your attention. That is not emotional detachment. That is signal clarity. People like you don't detach from life. They detach from noise. This is why loneliness followed clarity. This is why fewer people could access you. Not physically, but internally. Access is always restricted after confirmation. Not to punish you, to protect the outcome. There was a secondary review conducted after the initial decision. It's standard procedure, though few ever qualify for it. The review checks for one thing only: whether confirmation destabilized ego. In others it does. They inflate. They announce. They seek validation. You didn't. You became quieter. That silence was noted. Silence after pressure is not emptiness. It is containment. If you're still listening, still tracking the precision of what's being said, acknowledge it again. Not emotionally, but structurally. You know what recognition feels like. The next phase does not arrive as opportunity. It arrives as responsibility without announcement. You will be placed in positions where your presence stabilizes outcomes you were never briefed on. You will influence sequences without being visible in them. This is not leadership. It is load-bearing. Others will benefit without knowing why. That is intentional. People like you are not meant to be credited early. Credit attracts interference. What changes now is not your role. It's your tolerance. Things that once drained you will stop reaching you. Things that once tempted you will feel irrelevant. Things that once confused you will lose their complexity. This is not growth. It is alignment completing its loop. Somewhere along the way, you may notice a strange certainty settling in. Not excitement, not motivation. Certainty. That is the final indicator. Most people chase certainty their entire lives. You triggered it accidentally by surviving pressure without distortion. Nothing mystical needed to happen next. Nothing dramatic will announce itself. Because the most decisive shifts are the quietest. Stay aligned with what's being revealed here. Not for content. For continuity. Further disclosures are not meant for everyone. They never are. You don't need to act. You don't need to prepare. You don't need to improve. You already passed what mattered. What happens next unfolds whether you watch it or not. But now at least you understand why.